She thought she knew which brother held her in the dark. The silver ring against her skin said otherwise. Some loves are not chosen. They are unmasked. Our story begins this very moment. The Ministry of Magic dressed itself in gold for the Anglo-Bulgarian Accord, and Hermione Granger had decided, somewhere between the third speech and the fourth glass she would not drink, that she despised gold. It clung to everything. It pooled in the enchanted chandeliers that drifted at shoulder height like tame, luminous jellyfish. It gilded the rims of the goblets, the edges of the invitations, the threadwork on the banners that proclaimed cooperation between two ministries that had spent a century pretending the other did not exist. Gold was the color of occasions, and occasions exhausted her. They asked her to be a symbol, the brightest witch of her age, the war heroine, the proof that the world had healed, when all she wanted was to be a woman standing quietly near a wall with something cold in her hand. So she stood near the wall. She let the music wash past her, some slow Bulgarian waltz played on instruments that breathed rather than sang, and she watched the room turn. That was when she saw him, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath her shoes. Pale hair, almost white under the floating light. A jaw she could have drawn from memory in the dark. The particular set of the shoulders, held high and a little back, as though the body itself were a sentence written in a language she had spent years learning to read and to hate. Her pulse did something quick and traitorous, a flutter low in her throat, and she felt her fingers tighten around the stem of her glass until the cold of it bit into her skin. Malfoy. The name arrived before thought did. It always had. 6 years of corridors and curses had wired it into her, so that the sight of that hair could still raise the fine hairs along her arms like static gathering before a storm. But then he turned, and he smiled. Hermione had seen Draco Malfoy smile perhaps a dozen times in her life, and every one of those smiles had been a small cruelty, a smirk sharpened to wound, a curl of the lip that announced he had found something beneath him to enjoy. She knew that smile the way one knows the shape of an old scar. This was not that smile. This was open, unguarded. It reached the eyes and softened the whole architecture of the face, and it was aimed impossibly, warmly, directly at her, at a stranger across a crowded room, as though she were a lamp lit in a window after a long walk through cold country. The glass nearly slipped from her hand. He was already crossing toward her, and the closer he came, the more the illusion frayed and reformed into something stranger. The features were the same. The same fine bones, the same grey eyes the colour of the Channel in November. But where Draco wore his face like armour buckled too tight, this man wore his loosely, comfortably, the way one wears a coat that has been broken in by years of kindness. There was a faint line between his brows that spoke of laughter rather than disdain, and his hair was a touch longer, curling against his collar in a way Draco would have considered an unforgivable lapse in discipline. "Forgive me," he said, and his voice undid the last of her certainty. The accent was foreign, soft consonants, vowels that opened like windows. Nothing of the clipped glacial English she had braced herself against. "I have been watching you stand alone by this wall for a quarter of an hour, and I have decided that this is a tragedy I am personally obligated to correct." For a moment, she could not speak. Her mind, That swift and reliable instrument had simply stopped, the way a quill stops mid-word when the ink runs dry. "You're not him," she said at last, which was, she registered with a flush of horror, possibly the least intelligent thing she had said aloud in a decade. The stranger's smile deepened, and now there was something rueful in it, something that knew exactly what she meant and had clearly heard it before. "No," he said gently. "I am, I think, the one you did not expect." He inclined his head, a small old-fashioned bow that belonged to another century. "Corvus Malfoy, and you are Hermione Granger, which I know because I have read everything you have written on the rights of magical beings, and I confess I came to this tedious affair tonight chiefly in the hope that you would be at it." 3 things happened to Hermione in rapid succession. The first was that the name Malfoy, fastened to this warm and open creature, made no sense at all, like a sweet smell rising from something she had always known to be poison. The second was that he had read her work, not skimmed it, not flattered her about it, but cited it. The early treatises that almost no one remembered, the unfashionable ones she was proudest of, and the surprise of being seen like that, here, by him, sent a flush of unexpected pleasure up the back of her neck. The third was that she felt, suddenly and acutely, the weight of someone else's gaze upon her from across the room. A different gaze, heavier, colder, the kind of attention that pressed against the skin like a hand laid flat against a window from the other side. She turned her head before she could stop herself. There, near the great arched doorway, half in shadow where the gold light failed, stood the original, the true one, Draco. He was dressed in black so dark it seemed to drink the chandelier glow that fell upon it, and he was not smiling. He was watching her and his brother with an expression she could not name, something held very still, very controlled, a face arranged into careful blankness, the way one smooths a bedsheet over a thing one does not want found. But his hand, resting against the doorframe, had curled slowly into a fist, the knuckles standing pale and sharp beneath the skin, and he did not seem to know he had done it. Their eyes met across all that gilded distance. The music went on. The luminous jellyfish drifted, and for the length of a single held breath, the noise of the great room thinned to nothing, and there was only that line drawn taut between them, humming, the way the air hums in the half-second after a hex has been cast, and before anyone knows whether it has struck. Then Draco looked away first. It was such a small thing. A turn of the head, a deliberate redirection of attention towards some Bulgarian official who had appeared at his elbow. But Hermione had never in her life seen Draco Malfoy look away first from anything, and the wrongness of it stayed with her, an irritant under the skin, like a splinter too fine to find. "You know my brother," Corvus said. It was not quite a question. When she looked back at him, the warmth in his face had not dimmed, but something more careful had entered the grey of his eyes, a watchfulness, a tenderness, as though he were holding a thing that might break. "We were at school together," Hermione said. The words came out more clipped than she intended. "I didn't know he had a—" She stopped. Brother felt absurd. Twin felt impossible. "I didn't know about you. No one did. The Malfoys are not exactly forthcoming about me. No." Something passed over his features then, brief as a cloud shadow crossing a field, there and gone. It is a long story, and not a happy one, and I will not spoil a beautiful evening by telling it badly. Only this. He set down his own glass on the tray of a passing levitating salver and turned to face her fully, and the directness of him, the simple, uncomplicated attention, was so unlike anything she had ever received from a man wearing that face that she felt briefly unmoored. I was raised far from here, in the mountains, in the cold and the pine. I did not grow up a Malfoy in any way that matters. Whatever you know of that name, whatever it has cost you, and I think that it has cost you something. I would be glad if you would let me prove I am not the rumour. Across the room she was aware, she could not stop being aware, that Draco had not left, that he stood with his back half turned, listening to the Bulgarian official, and that his attention was nonetheless angled toward her like a compass needle that refused to settle north. "That's a great deal to promise a stranger by a wall," she said. Corvus laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised out of him, nothing rehearsed in it. "It is. You are right. I am told I do this. I leap." He pressed a hand briefly to his own chest, mock contrite. "My grandmother used to say I was born with my heart on the outside of my coat. Allow me to be more modest, then. Will you dance with me, Miss Granger? One dance. I promise to make no further declarations until at least the second." She should have said no. She was tired and she despised gold, and she had spent the better part of 7 years training herself out of any softness that bore the shape of that surname. But his hand was already extended, palm up, open, unhurried, and there was nothing in it of demand, only invitation, only the patience of a man willing to be refused. She thought, absurdly, of the way the other one had looked away first. "One dance," she heard herself say, "and no declarations." The warmth that broke over his face then was like sun coming through after a long grey week, and as his fingers closed gently around hers and drew her out toward the slow-turning floor, Hermione made the mistake, the small, fatal mistake, of glancing back over her shoulder one last time toward the arched doorway in the shadows. But the doorway was empty now, and Draco Malfoy was gone, and the place where he had stood seemed colder than the rest of the room, and Hermione did not understand, as Corvus's hand settled warm against the small of her back, and the music gathered them in, why the absence of a man she had spent her whole life despising should leave her feeling, for one bewildering instant, as though something had been taken from her that she had not known she possessed. The Joint Anglo-Bulgarian Liaison Committee met on the 4th floor of the ministry, in a room that smelled of cold tea and older grievances, and Hermione Granger learned in the first 10 minutes that the universe possessed a sense of humour, both cruel and exact. She had come prepared, folders squared at the corners, quill nibs trimmed, 3 contingency arguments for the creature protection clauses she expected the Bulgarians to resist. What she had not prepared for was the man already seated at the far end of the long table when she arrived, one ankle crossed over a knee, reviewing a sheaf of parchment with the unhurried arrogance of someone who had decided the meeting could not properly begin until he chose to notice it had. Draco Malfoy did not look up when she entered. He turned a page. The faint, dry rasp of it carried across the room, the particular sound of old parchment, and something in the deliberateness of the gesture told her he had registered her arrival the instant the door opened and had elected to make her wait. "You're the British attaché," she said. It was not a question, and it cost her something to keep her voice level. "I'm the British attaché." He turned another page. "Try not to sound so delighted. The room can't take it." She set her folders down with rather more force than the parchment required. Across the table, his eyes lifted at last, grey, opaque, giving away precisely nothing, and moved over her once, swift and clinical, the way one assesses a chess position one has already played out to its conclusion. "Where's your brother?" The words left her before she had decided to say them, and she regretted them at once, because his face did something, a brief stillness, a closing, and then resolved into a thin, cool smile that had nothing warm in it whatsoever. "Corvus," he said, "represents the Bulgarian delegation. I represent ours. Which means, Granger, that for the foreseeable future you will be sitting between us, like a coin held up to two different lights." He let that settle. "I imagine you'll find one side flatters you more than the other." She had no answer that would not betray her, so she gave him none and pulled out her chair, and the meeting, mercifully, began. It did not stay merciful long. The Bulgarians wanted concessions on cross-border apparition licensing. The British wanted reciprocity on wand registration. And somewhere in the third hour, when the cold tea had gone colder and the light through the high windows had thickened to the amber of late afternoon, Hermione made an argument she was proud of. Clean, structured, anchored in two precedents she had spent the night before unearthing. And Draco Malfoy dismantled it in 4 sentences. He did it without raising his voice. That was the worst of it. He simply found the seam in her reasoning, the one weak joint she had hoped no one would test, and pressed his thumb against it until the whole construction came apart in her hands. When he finished, he did not look smug. He looked almost bored, which was infinitely more insulting, and he turned his attention back to his parchment, as though she had already been resolved and filed away. The Bulgarian official to her left murmured something appreciative. Hermione felt the heat climb her throat. Her hand found the cuff of her sleeve and tugged it straight, then straighter, smoothing a fold that did not exist, the fabric already immaculate beneath her fingers. "You've changed your method," she said. He glanced up. "At school," she went on, and she kept her voice very even, very pleasant. "You'd have called me a name and felt you'd won. This is more efficient. I almost didn't recognize it as cruelty." For a moment, something flickered behind the grey. There and gone, a fish turning far down in dark water. Then it was smooth again. "I've found," he said quietly, "that the old method cost me more than it ever cost you. People do learn, Granger, even people you'd prefer not to." He set down his quill. "Though I notice you came in here expecting the boy from the train. You should be more careful. Expectation is a kind of armor, and armor has joints." A pause, waited. "I've made a small career of finding them." The room had gone quiet around them. The Bulgarians, sensing weather, had retreated into a sudden interest in their own documents. "Is that a threat?" she asked. "It's an observation." He gathered his parchment, squared it as she had squared her folders, an unconscious mirror of her own ritual that neither of them acknowledged. "We adjourn at 6. My brother will be sorry to have missed you. He talks about you a great deal, you know." Something tightened at the corner of his mouth, swiftly mastered. He has excellent taste and terrible judgment. The two are not always distinguishable. Then he rose and left, and Hermione sat alone at the long table with the cold tea and the amber light and the dismantled wreckage of her argument, and found that her heart was beating far too quickly for a woman who had simply lost a point in a meeting. Corvus was waiting for her in the atrium when she finally descended, and the sight of him eased something in her chest she had not known was clenched. He had brought her flowers, not roses, nothing so obvious, but a strange dark bloom she did not recognize, deep blue shading to black at the petal's edge, and when she leaned to breathe it in, it smelled of cold stone and something green and high and far away. "Mountain flowers," he said. "They grow only above the snow line, near Durmstrang. I had them sent. I thought." He hesitated, and the open vulnerability of him, the way he risked himself without hedging, undid her a little. "I thought you might like something that came from where I came from, so that you would know me a little better." "They're beautiful," she said, and meant it, and watched the relief and pleasure bloom across his face, and thought how easy he was to make happy, how little he hid, how everything in him moved toward the light without calculation. "My brother was insufferable to you," he said. "It was not a guess. I can see it. You wear it on your shoulders." He touched her arm lightly, briefly, a passing warmth. "He is. Hermione, I do not defend it, but I will explain it, because no one ever explained him to me until it was too late to matter. He was raised to be a fortress, every brick laid by someone who feared the world. I was sent away, and so I was never bricked up at all. We have the same face. We are not the same building." A wry, sad smile. "When you look at him and find him cold, you are looking at what they made of the boy I might have been." The words sat oddly in her. She had spent the day wanting to despise Draco Malfoy cleanly, the way she always had, and now his own brother had handed her a reason to pity him instead, and pity was a more complicated thing, with hooks in it. "You're kind to him," she said, "after everything they did to you, after they hid you away." Corvus was quiet a moment. Above them, the great atrium ceiling had darkened toward evening, the enchanted stars beginning their slow ignition. "He didn't choose to be the one they kept," he said simply. "And I didn't choose to be the one they hid. We were two infants in a prophecy neither of us spoke. I have decided not to spend my life angry at a brother for the accident of being born 5 minutes before me into a house that wanted only one son." He looked at her, and the warmth in him gathered towards something more serious. "I would rather spend it here, on a good evening, with you." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, courtly, gentle, asking nothing, and she let him, and it was lovely and warm and entirely without complication. And yet, that was the trouble, and yet. As his mouth brushed her hand, she found her gaze drifting against all sense to the bank of lifts across the atrium, where the grills were sliding shut on the last departing officials. And in the final one, just before the doors closed, she caught a flash of pale hair and a face turned toward her. The same face, the cold one, the fortress, watching her hand held against his brother's lips, with an expression stripped suddenly bare, raw and unguarded for one unbearable instant. before the grille clashed shut and bore him upward and out of sight. Hermione stood very still in the darkening atrium with the strange dark flowers cold against her arm and Corvus's warm mouth on her hand. And she could not have said, if her life had hung upon the answer, which of the two brothers her stuttering heart was beating for. The committee ran late on a Thursday in the second week, and by the time the last Bulgarian official gathered his coat and departed with a courtly nod, the ministry had emptied around them into that particular hush that falls on great buildings after hours, the hush of cooling stone and dimmed lamps and corridors where the footsteps of one's own going carry too far. Hermione should have left with the rest. The case files could wait, but the licensing dossier had to be cross-referenced before tomorrow's session, and she had never in her life been able to leave a thing half-finished. And so she stayed, spreading the parchment across the long table beneath the single lamp the room kept lit. And she did not notice that she was not alone until a glass of water appeared at her elbow without a word. She looked up. Draco had not gone either. He stood beside her chair, having set the water down within reach, and there was nothing in his face she could use. No smirk, no challenge, only the flat grey watchfulness she had begun, unwillingly, to recognize as the thing he wore when he had decided not to wound. "You haven't eaten," he said. "You've been pressing the heel of your hand to your sternum for the last hour. You do it when you're hungry and won't admit it. You did it in the library in 5th year too, over the prefect rotas." A pause. "I notice things. It's a tedious habit." She had not known anyone had ever noticed that. She had not known she did it. Her hand traitorously lowered from her chest. "Why are you still here?" she said. "Because the cross-reference on the apparition clause is wrong, and you'll find it in about 40 minutes, and I'd rather not lose another night of sleep to your discovering at dawn what I could simply tell you now." He pulled out the chair across from her, not beside, across the table's width left deliberately between them, and sat and drew a sheet of the parchment toward himself and turned it so the figures faced her. "Here, the Bulgarians transposed the regional codes. It isn't sabotage, it's incompetence. You've spent 2 days hunting for a conspiracy in a clerical error." She bent over the figures. He was right. Of course he was right. The wrongness leapt out at her the moment he pointed to it, the way a misspelt word leaps off a page once seen, and she felt the small hot prick of having missed it. "You could have let me waste the night," she said. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He did not answer at once. The lamp between them threw its small, steady circle, and beyond it the room fell away into dark, and somewhere far off in the building a door closed, and the echo of it travelled the empty corridor and died. When he spoke, his voice had changed, lower, with something underneath it held very carefully in check. "Corvus would have let you waste it," he said. "He'd have brought you flowers in the morning and told you that you were brilliant, and he'd have meant it, and you'd never have known he hadn't noticed you were drowning." His jaw tightened, the muscle leaping once beneath the pale skin. "He loves you the way you love a painting, from the correct distance, with great feeling and no inconvenience to himself." The unfairness of it should have made her furious. It nearly did. But there was something in the way he said it, not triumphant, not even unkind, but worn, as though the words cost him to release, That snagged the fury before it caught. "That's a vicious thing to say about your own brother," she said quietly. "He's the only person in your family who never did you a wrong." "I know." 2 words, and they landed like stones into a deep well. He looked down at the parchment, and his hand, long, pale, the silver signet ring catching the lamplight, flattened slowly against the figures, pressing them down as though to hold something still. "I know exactly what he is. That's rather the problem." His thumb moved once against the cold band of the ring, the only restless thing about him. "He's everything they should have made and didn't, and he's standing in the one place I—" He stopped. The sentence hung in the lamplit air, unfinished, and the silence after it was the loudest thing in the room. Hermione found she had stopped breathing. The whole long day of friction, of his cool, dismantling cruelties, narrowed suddenly to this, to the bitten-off end of a confession he had clearly never meant to begin, and to the way he would not look at her, his gaze fixed hard on the parchment, as though the regional codes of Bulgarian apparition law might save him. "Standing in the one place you what?" she said. Barely a whisper. His eyes came up. For the length of a single heartbeat, the fortress had no walls. She saw straight through to whatever lived behind them, and it was not cold at all. It was something starved and watchful and afraid, something that had wanted for a very long time, and had been taught with great thoroughness never to reach. The lamplight trembled. The distance across the table seemed suddenly to be nothing, a hand's breadth, a held breath, and the air between them had thickened until it pressed against her skin like the charged stillness before lightning splits the sky. She became aware of small things with terrible clarity. The faint scent of him beneath the cold tea and old parchment, clean, sharp, a trace of something like ozone, the smell the air takes after a spell has burned through it, the pulse visible at the base of his throat. The fact that his hand, flat upon the table, had crept perhaps an inch toward the center while he was not attending to it, fingers half curled, and that her own hand had done the same, so that they lay now in the lamplight a mere span apart, 2 pale shapes drawn together across the dark wood by some gravity neither had authorized. She looked at the narrow gap between their hands. She thought of mountain flowers, blue shading to black, cold against her arm. She thought of a warm mouth on her knuckles, and a man who hid nothing and asked nothing and made her happy with such terrible ease. And she thought, "I am not allowed to feel this." She withdrew her hand, slowly, deliberately. She drew it back into her lap and folded it there with the other, and she watched the loss of it move across his face. A flinch so small it would have been invisible to anyone who had not, for one unguarded moment, been permitted to see behind the wall. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, for the cross reference. Something closed in him. The fortress rebuilt itself stone by stone, swift and practiced, and by the time he rose from his chair, the grey of his eyes had gone opaque again, the watchfulness folded away where it could not be used against him. "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank the Bulgarians for being illiterate." He gathered his coat from the back of the chair. At the edge of the lamp's circle, he stopped, half-turned, his face thrown into shadow so that only the pale hair caught the light. "He's a good man, my brother. better than I'll ever be. You've chosen well. A beat. I only wonder whether you chose him, Granger, or whether you chose the absence of everything you were afraid I'd make you feel. He did not wait for her answer. He crossed the dark room and the door closed behind him, and the echo of it ran the length of the empty corridor and faded. And Hermione Granger sat alone in the small circle of lamplight with the corrected dossier and the untouched glass of water, and her own hand folded tight in her lap, pressed hard against the place over her sternum, where, she realized only now, the ache had never once been hunger. Corvus took her to the river on a Sunday, to a small floating restaurant moored beneath a willow whose trailing branches had been charmed to glow a soft amber after dusk. And it was, by every measure she could name, a perfect evening. He had thought of everything. A table by the rail, where the Thames slid past dark and slow, and threw the lamplight back in long broken ribbons. A bottle of something pale and Bulgarian that tasted of green apples and cold mornings. He told her about his childhood in the mountains, the wolves that came down in winter, the long blue dusks, the old witch who had raised him and taught him that warmth was not weakness, but the hardest courage there was. He made her laugh 3 times. He listened, truly listened, his chin propped on his hand, his grey eyes, those eyes the same and not the same, fixed on her with an attention so complete and so untroubled that she felt, for stretches of minutes, genuinely and uncomplicatedly happy. That was the word for it. Uncomplicated. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his thumb moved over her knuckles, and there was nothing in the touch but tenderness. No charge, no static gathering, no sense of standing at the edge of something that might break under her. Just a warm hand holding hers above a glowing river while a willow burned gold overhead. "You've gone somewhere," he said gently. "Twice now tonight. You smile, and then your eyes go away from me, and I lose you for a moment to wherever it is." She came back to him with a small guilty start. "I'm sorry. It's the committee. It follows me home." "The committee?" He said it lightly, but something in his face had grown quiet and attentive, the way still water grows attentive to a stone before it has even fallen. "My brother is on the committee." "Your brother is on the committee," she agreed, and reached for her glass, and was annoyed to find that she reached for it a little too quickly, that her fingers needed something to do. Corvus did not press. That was his particular grace. He never pressed, never pried, never set a hook and waited for her to bleed. He only turned his glass slowly by its stem and watched the amber light move in the wine, and when he spoke again, it was in the soft, unhurried voice of a man telling a thing he had decided, some while ago, that he would have to say aloud eventually. "When we were born," he said, "there was a seer in the family, a great aunt, half mad by all accounts, but the gift in her was real, and she looked at 2 infants in a single cradle, and she said that one of the sons would be the undoing of the house. She would not say which." He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. You can imagine the panic. A great old family, terrified of a prophecy it could not read. And so they did the sensible, monstrous thing. They kept one son and sent the other away, where the prophecy, if it lived in him, could do its damage to no one who mattered. He spread his hands. They guessed it was me. They were so frightened of the curse in me that they exiled me to the mountains and raised the other in the full weight of everything they were." Hermione had set down her glass. The willow burned softly above them. "And was it you?" she asked. "The undoing?" "No." He looked out at the dark water. It was him. Of course it was him. They kept the boy they meant to save, and they made him into exactly the thing the seer feared. They laid every brick of it themselves, out of love, out of terror, never seeing that they were building the very ruin they fled. He took the mark. He let them into his home. The house nearly fell, and it fell because of the son they kept, not the son they cast out. A long breath. "I grew up warm and free and far away, and I never had to make a single one of the choices that broke him. I am not a better man than my brother Hermione. I am only a luckier one. I have never once been tested the way he was tested and found wanting. It is a very easy thing to be kind when nothing has ever asked you to be cruel. The fairness of it, the terrible, generous fairness, sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. She had wanted, for weeks now, to keep the two of them clean and separate in her mind. The warm one she had chosen, the cold one she had survived. And here was the warm one himself, gently, lovingly, dismantling the wall between them, refusing to let her hate his brother in peace. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Her voice came out lower than she meant it. Corvus was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across and took her hand again, both hands now folding hers between them. And his face was so open, so without defense, that she could hardly bear to look at it. "Because I am not a fool," he said softly. "And I love you. And I have watched your eyes go away from me twice tonight, and I am beginning to understand the country they go to." He pressed her hand once and released it, gently, before she could pull it back, sparing them both. "I am not asking you anything. I would never set you a trap and call it a question. I only wanted you to know that I see it, whatever it is, and that I would rather you were honest with yourself than kind to me." She wanted to deny it. She opened her mouth to deny it, the denial fully formed and ready. "There is nothing. He is nothing to me. He is the boy who called me mudblood in a corridor." And she found she could not push the words past her teeth because they were no longer true. And she had always, to her own ruin, been incapable of saying a thing she knew to be false. The silence stretched. The river slid by. And in that silence, Corvus had his answer, and she saw him receive it, saw the small, brave settling in his face, the grief of it gentled by something almost like relief, as though a weight long carried had finally been set down. "It's all right," he murmured. "Hermione, look at me. It is all right." But it was not all right, none of it. And she could not look at him, because to look at him would be to confirm the thing she was not ready to confirm even to herself. And so she looked instead at the dark water and the broken ribbons of lamplight upon it, and she felt the perfect evening close over her head, like a wave. And somewhere across the city, in a house she had never seen, a man with the same face and a colder soul was sitting alone with the thing he had bitten off the end of in a lamplit committee room, and she pressed her hand once more, helplessly, to the ache over her sternum that had never, not once, been hunger. It broke open on a Tuesday in the rain. The session had gone badly from the first hour. A clause on extradition that the British had thought settled came unstuck. Tempers frayed along the long table, and Hermione, who had not slept properly since the floating restaurant, who had been avoiding both brothers with the grim discipline of a woman avoiding a draught she suspects of poison, found her composure worn down to the thread. When the meeting finally collapsed into adjournment and the others fled into the corridor, she stayed to gather her ruined notes, and so did he. And then they were alone again, and the storm outside threw itself against the high windows in long grey sheets. "You changed the extradition language," she said. She did not turn around. "It was agreed. I had it agreed, and you went behind it and changed it, and you let me defend a version that no longer existed for 40 minutes in front of the entire delegation. I improved it." His voice was flat behind her. "The version you'd agreed would have let the Bulgarians extradite half-bloods on a magistrate's whim. I assumed you'd prefer to look briefly foolish over genuinely complicit. Clearly, I overestimated your priorities." She turned then. The rain light from the windows had drained the colour from the room, and he stood in it grey as a figure carved from slate, and the careful blankness she had learned to read was cracked at the edges with something that had been worn raw. He was tired too, she saw, tired in the way she was tired, and that recognition only made her angrier. "Don't," she said. "Don't dress up cruelty as protection. You humiliated me to win a point, and you've decided to call it chivalry. I'm not Corvus, Granger. I don't bring you mountain flowers and let you walk into a fire smiling." The words came sharp now, the control fraying. "If you wanted a man who'd protect your dignity at the cost of your principles, you should keep the one you have. He's very good at it. Leave him out of it." "I can't." It cracked out of him, louder than he intended, and the rawness of it stopped them both. He pressed his lips together, mastered it, but when he went on, his voice had dropped to something quieter and far more dangerous. "That's rather the difficulty, isn't it? I can't leave him out of anything. He has my face and your—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "He has everything, and he didn't have to earn a single piece of it, and he wears it so easily. He earned being a decent man. He earned it in the cold, in exile, with no family and no name. And he came out of it kind, and you came out of a mansion and a fortune, and you came out of it this." She flung a hand at him, at all of him. "Don't you dare envy him his goodness. You had every advantage he never had, and you chose—" "I know what I chose." It was very soft. It cut clean through her, the way only true things can. "You don't have to recite it. I was there." The rain hammered the glass. Somewhere below them, the building murmured to itself, pipes and stone, and the small, constant business of a world that did not care. They stood 3 feet apart in the grey light, both breathing hard, and Hermione felt the static of it standing on her skin, the air gone tight and charged the way it goes before the storm finds its centre. "At the manor," she said. She had not meant to say it. It came up out of her like water finding a crack, and once it had begun, she could not stop it. "On the floor of your drawing room, with your aunt's knife at my throat and her wand carving filth into my arm. You stood by the fire. You watched. You said nothing." Her voice shook now, the old terror climbing up through the anger. "So, don't tell me about being tested and found wanting, as though it were a tragedy that happened to you. I have the scar. I have it still. That's what you chose, Malfoy. You chose to look at the fire. The colour went out of his face entirely. She had wanted to wound him. She had aimed it and thrown it, and it had struck. She saw it land, saw something behind his eyes simply break, and for one savage instant she was glad. And then the gladness curdled, because his hand had risen to the back of his chair, and his knuckles had gone bone white where they gripped it. And he was not arguing. He was not defending himself. He was standing very still with his eyes fixed on her arm, on the sleeve that covered the word. And his throat was moving, as though he were trying to swallow something that would not go down. "I didn't watch the fire," he said. It was barely audible. "I couldn't look at you. That's not—" He stopped, started again, and the words came out of him jagged, dragged up from somewhere with no practice at speaking. "If I had looked at you, I would have done something. And if I had done something, they would have killed you in front of me and then killed my mother. And so I looked at the fire, and I have looked at that fire every night for 7 years." His hand on the chair back trembled once, hard and stilled. "I'm not asking you to forgive it. There's no version of it that deserves forgiving. You said I said nothing. I want you to know it wasn't nothing. The nothing was the most expensive thing I have ever done." The room had gone very quiet. The rain had softened to a steady whisper against the glass. Hermione stood with her ruined notes forgotten in her hand and found that she was crying, silently, the tears coming without her permission, and she did not know, she truly did not know, whether they were for herself on that drawing-room floor or for the boy who had stood by the fire and learned to disappear inside his own skin, because it was the only mercy left to him. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. It was the 3rd time she had asked one of them that question, and she heard the pattern of it and hated it. He looked at her. The fortress was gone. There was nothing left of it, only the raw, starved thing beneath, and it was looking at her with no defense at all. "Because you're going to marry my brother," he said simply, "and I will stand in a church and watch you do it and say nothing. And I have discovered that I would rather you knew the truth of me before you do. Not so that you'll choose differently. You won't. You shouldn't. Only so that when you remember me, you remember the right man." His mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "I've spent my whole life being remembered as the wrong one. I find I can't bear it from you." He let go of the chair. He crossed to the door. And at the threshold, he paused and did not turn, and the grey rainlight fell across the side of his face, and Hermione saw, with a clarity that struck her like cold water, that he was holding himself upright by an act of pure will, that the leaving was costing him everything he had. "Good night, Granger," he said, very evenly. And then he was gone into the corridor, and his footsteps fell away into the empty building, unhurried, controlled, each one perfectly measured. And it was the measured perfection of them, the terrible discipline that undid her completely, because she understood at last that she had never once in all these years seen Draco Malfoy lose control, and that she had just watched him spend the very last of it walking out a door so that she would not have to watch him break. Corvus was called to Sophia on the 11th of the month. A sudden recall, some crisis in the licensing accords that no owl could resolve. And he came to her flat to say goodbye on the evening before he left, standing in her doorway with the rain on his shoulders and a sadness in his face that she had begun to understand the source of. 3 days, he said, perhaps 4. I will write. He took her hand and kissed it, courtly as ever, and then he held it a moment longer than the kiss required and looked at her with those grey eyes that knew too much. Hermione, while I am gone, be honest with yourself. That is all I ask. Not for me, for you. And then he was gone down the wet stairs, and she stood in the doorway and watched the dark swallow him, and felt only a complicated tenderness where, 3 weeks ago, there would have been the ache of a parting lover. So she was alone on the 12th when the knock came. She had not lit the lamps. The rain had returned at dusk and settled in for the night, a soft, insistent murmur against the windows. And she had been sitting in the half-dark with a cold cup of tea, and the committee dossier she could not make herself read. And when the knock came, soft, almost hesitant, her heart leapt up before her mind could name the reason. She opened the door. He stood on the landing with the rain in his pale hair, and for one disorienting instant, the whole architecture of her chest reorganized itself, because she could not tell. In the dark, in the rain, with his collar turned up and his face half in shadow, she could not tell which one he was. You came back early, she said. The crisis resolved itself faster than they feared. A pause. The voice was soft. The consonants, were they soft? She could not be sure. The rain had gentled everything. May I come in? It's a filthy night, and I find I didn't want to spend it alone in an empty hotel. She stood aside. He came in, shedding rain, and she lit the lamps at last. But only the small ones, the low amber ones by the window, because the overhead light felt suddenly too honest for the hour. And in that soft, inconstant glow, they began, almost without deciding to, the best evening of her life. She would try, afterward, to find the moment she should have known. There was no moment. There was only a slow accumulation of grace. He had brought wine, pale and green-tasting, and he poured it, and they sat by the rain-streaked window, and he listened to her the way the warm one always listened, chin on his hand, eyes on her face. But tonight, there was something underneath the listening, a current, a heat she did not remember from the floating restaurant, and she found herself talking as she had never talked to anyone, the words coming up out of her in a long, unguarded stream. She told him about the fear that woke her at 3 in the morning, about the scar she never let anyone see, and how she had stopped, a year ago, even looking at it herself, about the loneliness of being a symbol, of being the brightest witch of her age and nobody's particular girl. And he did not soothe her, did not bring her flowers in the morning of his mind and tell her she was brilliant. He met it, all of it, with a quiet that held her. And once, when her voice cracked over the scar, he reached across and laid 2 fingers very lightly against her wrist, over the place where the sleeve hid the word, and he did not press, and he did not speak, and the silence of it said, I know, I was there more completely than any sentence could. She did not register the strangeness of that, not then. They talked until the wine was gone, and the rain had become the only sound in the world. At some point she had moved closer, or he had. The The space between them on the narrow window seat had simply ceased to exist, and his shoulder was warm against hers, and when she turned her head, he was already turned toward her, and the lamplight lay along the fine bones of that face she had loved and hated in two different men, and the air between them had drawn tight as a held breath, charged, humming, every fine hair on her arms standing up in the static of it. "I've never," she whispered, and did not know how to finish. "I know," he said. "Neither have I. Not like this." His hand came up, and his fingers brushed the curve of her jaw, traced it, slow, reverent, and she felt the cold bite of a silver ring against her skin, and did not think to wonder why a man raised in the mountains with no family and no inheritance should wear an old silver signet. She felt only the small electric shock of the metal and the warmth of the fingers and the way her own breath had gone shallow and quick. He kissed her. It was not like the Willow restaurant. It was not warm and untroubled and easy. It was slow, and it shook. Both of them, it shook them. There was hunger in it, held on a leash so tight she could feel the trembling of the restraint, a wanting so long denied that its sudden permission was almost grief. And she understood, kissing him, with her hands fisted in the front of his shirt and her heart slamming against her ribs, that she had never in her life been kissed by someone who wanted her this much and had waited this long, and that some starved and watchful thing in her had been waiting too, all this while, for exactly this, for someone who had to look at the fire because he could not bear to look at her. She did not think the word. The word was there, fully formed, hovering just beneath the surface of the night, and she did not let herself think it, because to think it would be to end the most perfect hours she had ever known. And so she pulled him closer instead, and the lamps burned low, and the rain came down, and for one whole night, the most honest woman in the wizarding world told herself a story she desperately wanted to be true. She woke at dawn. The rain had stopped. Grey light lay across the room, thin and cold and merciless, the light that does not flatter and does not lie. And he was still asleep beside her, his pale hair against the pillow, his face, in sleep, with all the day's vigilance let down, utterly defenseless. She lay very still and looked at him, and her chest was full of a warmth so large it frightened her, and she thought, "I have to tell Corvus. There is no kind way, but there is an honest one, and he asked me only to be honest." And she lifted her hand to brush the hair from the sleeping face of the man she had decided, in the dark, was Corvus, and saw, in the cold dawn light, on the hand that lay open on the pillow between them, the old silver signet ring with a serpent crest she had seen across a committee table 100 times, biting into the morning light. Her whole body went cold. She knew that ring. She had watched that thumb move against that band in a lamplit room while a man bit off the end of a confession. She had felt it last night against her jaw and not let herself know it. The mountains had no signet. The exile had no crest. The warm one wore nothing on his hands at all. The man asleep beside her, the man she had opened every locked room of herself to, the man who had kissed her as though he had been starving his whole life, was not Corvus. He stirred. His eyes opened, grey, opaque no longer, soft with sleep and something terribly close to peace, and they found her face, and for one instant, before memory and circumstance came flooding back into them, Draco Malfoy looked at her with a happiness so complete and so unguarded that it would, she knew even in that frozen moment, break her heart for the rest of her life. Then he saw her face, and the peace drained out of him like colour out of the dawn, and he understood all at once that she knew. Get out. She was on her feet before she knew she had moved. The sheet clutched to her, her back against the cold wall, and her voice came out of her in a register she did not recognize. Low, scraped raw, shaking with something past fury. Hermione! Don't say my name. She was shaking so hard the sheet trembled in her fists. You don't get to say my name. You came here wearing his face. You let me. I told you things I have never told a living soul. I let you. I thought you were him. The word cracked. Get dressed and get out of my flat. He did not argue. That was the worst of it somehow, that he did not defend himself, did not reach for a single one of the clever, cutting things she had braced for. He rose and gathered his clothes in silence and dressed with his back to her, and every line of his body was bent under something heavy. And when he finally turned to face her, his face had gone the grey of the dawn light, bloodless, and his hands hung empty at his sides. I didn't come here to deceive you, he said. His voice was very quiet. You opened the door, and you said you came back early, and I... His jaw worked. I should have corrected you. In the first 3 seconds, I should have said, no, I'm the other one. I'm the wrong one. And I opened my mouth to do it. And then you smiled at me, the way you have never once smiled at me in 7 years. And I... He stopped. His hand had risen halfway and fallen again. I'm not going to insult you by pretending it was a kindness. It was the most selfish thing I have ever done. I let you believe it, because for one night, I wanted to be the man you'd let into the room. I have no defense. I'm not offering one. Then offer nothing. She turned her face to the window so she would not have to look at the face that had betrayed her in 2 men at once. Just go. He went. She heard the soft click of the door and his footsteps on the stairs, measured, controlled, perfect. And she stood with her forehead against the cold glass and the grey light. And she did not cry, because she had gone somewhere past crying, into a country of pure stillness, where the only sound was the dreadful clarity of the truth she had been refusing for weeks. That the best night of her life had been spent with the man she had spent her life despising, and that the despising had been a wall, and that the wall had come down in the dark, and there was no honest way to build it again. Corvus came home that afternoon. She had meant to wait. She had meant to compose herself, to find the kind words and the honest ones both, to give him the dignity of a careful conversation. But when he stood in her doorway with his travelling cloak still on, and his warm grey eyes already searching her face, the whole careful architecture collapsed, and she simply stood there with her ruin showing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped inside and shut the door gently behind him and said, with a tenderness that nearly destroyed her, "Ah, so it has happened then. Corvus, no." He raised a hand, not to silence her, but to gentle her, and crossed to take both her cold hands in his warm ones, and his face, his open, undefended face, held no anger at all, only a sorrow so clean and so generous that she could hardly bear the weight of it. Sit down with me, and let me say it first, because I have known it longer than you have. and it will be easier on us both." She sat. He sat across from her, still holding her hands, and the late light came golden through the window, now that the rain had passed, and he gathered himself. "I knew the first night," he said, "at the ministry, by the wall, when you turned and saw me, and your whole face changed, because for one moment you thought I was him. I felt it then, the old current that ran between you two before I ever entered the room. I have spent my life as the brother who was sent away, Hermione. I know better than anyone what it is to stand outside a thing and look in at it through glass. I knew I was standing outside you. I only hoped for a while that I was wrong." A faint, brave smile. "I am very seldom wrong. It is one of my more tiresome qualities." "I never meant—" Her voice broke. "He came to my flat wearing your— I thought he was you. I would never have—" Something flickered across Corvus's face. Surprise, and then a slow, complicated understanding, and then, astonishingly, something that was almost a laugh, rueful and pained. "He did that?" He shook his head slowly. "Oh, my brother, my reckless, drowning brother." He looked at her with a sudden, fierce gentleness. "Listen to me. Listen. Whatever he did, however he did it, he did not make you feel a thing that was not already there. A trick cannot counterfeit what you felt. It can only reveal it. You did not fall for a deception, Hermione. You fell for the truth that the deception let you stop hiding from. Those are not the same, and you must not let your shame at the one blind you to the other." She stared at him. "How can you possibly be saying this to me? I betrayed you." "You did not betray me. You were honest with me from the first, even when you did not have the words." He released her hands and rose and went to the window and stood looking out at the gold-washed street with his back to her. And when he spoke again, his voice was steady, but she heard the cost in it. "I am going home, Hermione. Back to Sophia, for good. The Accords can be managed by Owl and by lesser men. I came to England chasing a feeling, and I found a remarkable woman, and I found that she was already spoken for by a bond older than I am. And I find, to my own surprise, that I am not even angry. I am only sad, and underneath the sadness I am." He turned. His eyes were bright. "I am glad. For him. God help me. He has spent his whole life being the wrong son, the wrong twin, the wrong man. He deserves once to be the right one, and he will only believe it if it comes from you. Corvus, he loves you." He said it simply, finally, laying it down between them like a gift. "He has loved you, I think, since long before he understood that the loving was possible. My brother does not know how to want things gently. He was never taught. So when he wants like a man going under for the third time. You saw it last night, even believing he was me. That hunger you felt, that was not mine. I have never been that hungry for anything in my life because I have never been starved." He crossed back to her and bent and pressed his lips one last time to her forehead. Not her hand now, her brow a benediction. "Go to him, or don't, but do not punish him for being the one who could not bear to look at the fire. That man has been punished enough, and most of all by himself." He gathered his cloak. At the door he paused, and the warmth of him filled the small flat one final time. "I will write to you both," he said, "from Sophia, and one day, perhaps, you will come and see the mountains, and I will show you the snow line where the blue flowers grow, and we will all of us be old friends, and this will be a story we tell." He smiled, and it reached his eyes, and there was no wound left in it at all. "Be brave, Hermione Granger. You are so brave about everything else. Be brave about this." And then the warm one was gone, gently, the way he did everything, and Hermione sat alone in the golden light, with both brothers' truths ringing in her ears. And across the city, a man who had walked out of her flat at dawn with his control held together by sheer will, was sitting alone with the knowledge that he had finally, irreparably, lost the only thing he had ever let himself want. She did not go to him for 3 days. She told herself it was pride. Then she told herself it was prudence. Then, on the 3rd night, sitting again in the dark with the cold tea and the dossier she still had not read, she told herself the truth, which was that she was afraid, not of him, but of the size of the thing she would have to admit if she went, and of the fact that there would be no taking it back once it was said aloud. It was Corvus's letter that decided her. It came on the 4th morning, owl-born from Sophia, 3 lines in a warm, slanting hand. He has not left his house in 4 days. The ministry thinks he is ill. I think he is doing the thing he does best, which is to disappear quietly into himself so that no one will have to be troubled by him. Do not let him. See. She went that evening. In the rain, of course. It had become the weather of the whole affair, and she had stopped fighting it. Malfoy's house was not the manor. He had left the manor years ago, she learned later, and never gone back. But a narrow, tall townhouse in a quiet, wizarding row. And when the door opened, it was not a house elf, but the man himself, in shirt sleeves, unshaven, the careful architecture of him entirely undone. He went very still at the sight of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the rain came down between them on the step, and his hand on the door frame had gone white at the knuckles, gripping, the way it had in the committee room, the way it had at school, the only tell he had ever owned. "Granger," he said. His voice was a ruin. "If you've come to say it again, to tell me what I am, you needn't have got wet. I know the words. I've been saying them to myself for 4 days. I expect I do it better than you could." "I didn't come for that." Her heart was going so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Let me in. I'm soaked, and I have things to say, and I will not say them on a doorstep in the rain like a character in a bad novel." Something that was almost, a flicker of the old dry humour crossed his ravaged face. He stood aside. The house inside was beautiful and cold and untouched, the rooms of a man who lived in only one of them. He led her to that one, a study, books to the ceiling, a fire burned down to embers, and he did not offer her a seat, and she did not take one. They stood facing each other across the worn carpet, and the firelight threw long shadows, and the rain whispered at the dark windows, and for a long moment the only sound was their breathing and the settle of the dying coals. "Corvus has gone home," she said. "I know. He wrote to me." A muscle moved in his jaw. He said... He stopped. It doesn't matter what he said. He's a better man than I am, and he proved it one last time by being decent about a thing I did to him that doesn't deserve decency. You should have gone with him. He's everything you... Stop. She said it quietly, and it stopped him. Stop telling me what I should want. Both of you have spent weeks telling me what I should want. He told me to be brave, And you keep telling me to choose the easy thing. And I am so tired of being managed by men who have decided they know my heart better than I do." She took a breath. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her sides. "So, I am going to tell you what I want, and you are going to be quiet and let me, because it cost me our 4 days and a great deal of pride to get here, and I will not be interrupted." He went still, utterly, as though afraid that any motion might frighten the moment away. "That night," she said, and her voice nearly failed and she forced it on. "You let me believe you were him, and it was wrong, and I was right to throw you out, and I'm not unsaying any of that. But Corvus said something to me, and I've turned it over for 4 days, and he was right, and I hate that he was right." She lifted her chin. "He said a trick can't counterfeit what I felt. It can only reveal it. I have never in my life been as honest with anyone as I was with you that night, believing you were a man I'd chosen for being safe. And I wasn't honest because of the deception. I was honest because for the first time I was with someone who had already seen me at my worst, on a floor, screaming with my blood on the boards, and hadn't looked away in disgust. You looked away because you couldn't bear it. I know the difference now. It took me 7 years and 1 terrible night, but I know it." His chest rose and fell. He did not speak. His eyes had begun very faintly to shine. "I spent all this time," she went on, lower now, "thinking I'd fallen for the right twin, the warm one, the one with no war in him. And I had. I do love Corvus in a clean, uncomplicated way that would have made a perfectly good and perfectly grey life." She swallowed. "But I never lay awake over Corvus. I never felt the air change when he walked into a room. He never noticed I press my hand to my chest when I'm starving and won't admit it. You noticed that. You, who I'd have sworn never saw anything in me but a thing to wound." Her voice broke at last, the tears coming. "I don't want the man who makes me happy and easy. God help me, Draco. I want the one who makes the whole room go tight, who I have to argue with to feel my own pulse. I want the difficult one. I want you. And I have never been so unhappy to want anything in my life." For a moment, he did not move at all. Then he crossed the carpet 3 strides and stopped just short of her, close enough that she had to tip her head back, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him and see that his hands had begun to shake worse than hers. "Say it again," he said hoarsely. "The last part. I have to hear it again, because I have spent 4 days teaching myself you'd never say it, and I can't have made it up." "I want you," she said. "You impossible, dishonest, broken man. I want you." His hand came up. It hovered an inch from her face. The same gesture, the same hesitation as that night, but no deception in it now. Nothing borrowed, only Draco Malfoy with his whole ruined heart in his eyes asking permission he had never once in his life believed he'd be granted. And she answered it by closing the last inch herself, turning her cheek into his palm, and she felt the cold bite of the silver signet against her skin. His ring, his crest, no longer a clue to a lie, but simply the truth of who held her. And she heard the breath go out of him, like a man surfacing from deep water. "I'm not going to be good at this," he said against her mouth, already shaking, already lost. "I don't know how to want a thing gently. I'll do it badly. I'll do it desperately. I've never..." I know, she said. I don't want it gently either. And then he kissed her in the firelight, with the rain on the dark windows and the embers falling soft in the grate. Not the borrowed kiss of a stolen night, but his own, claimed at last in his own name. And it was nothing like the Willow restaurant, nothing easy or warm or grey. It was the whole storm finding its centre and breaking open at last, 7 years of it. And she fisted her hands in his shirt and held on. And the dying fire threw their joined shadow tall against the wall of books, 2 figures with no distance left between them at all. 2 years later, on a bright morning in early summer, the narrow, tall townhouse in the quiet Wizarding Row was in a state of cheerful catastrophe, and Hermione Malfoy was losing an argument about luggage. "We are going for 6 days," she said, standing in the bedroom doorway with her arms folded and her wedding ring catching the morning light. 6. You have packed enough robes to last a season at court." "We're attending a wedding," Draco said, from somewhere inside the open trunk, where he was folding things with the grim precision of a man diffusing a curse. "My brother's wedding, to a Bulgarian witch whose family, by all accounts, owns most of a mountain. I will not arrive at the most important day of Corvus's life looking like I dressed out of a charity hamper. We have a name to—" He stopped himself. It was an old reflex. The "we" have a name, and they both heard it land, and he looked up from the trunk with a rueful tilt to his mouth that 2 years ago his face would not have known how to make. "We have a name to honor," he finished more quietly, "by being happy at it, which we will be. So I'm packing the grey robes as well as the black. And you're not going to win this, and you knew that when you started." She crossed the room and dropped onto the edge of the bed beside the disastrous trunk, and reached out and smoothed a crease from his collar that did not need smoothing. The gesture had migrated to her over 2 years, the small fussing tenderness, and neither of them ever remarked on it. He caught her hand and pressed his mouth to the inside of her wrist, over the place where, hidden under 2 years of his patient devotion, the old words still lay carved in her skin. He kissed it every morning. He had never once explained why, and she had never once asked, because she knew it was the fire, and he had stopped looking away from it. "Read me his letter again," she said. "The last one, before we go." Draco abandoned the trunk and sat beside her on the bed and drew the parchment from his breast pocket, where he had been carrying it for a week, soft now at the folds from rereading. Corvus's warm, slanting hand filled the page. He read it aloud, and his voice, which still went cool and clipped with the rest of the world, had learned a different register entirely for the things that mattered. "My dear brother and my dearer sister, for you are both now, and I will not be argued out of it. Yana says I must stop writing such long letters, or there will be nothing left to say across the dinner table. But I have spent so much of my life with an ocean of silence between us, brother, that I find I cannot stop talking to you now that I am allowed. So forgive me. I will be brief for me, which is to say not brief at all. I have a confession and a wedding gift, and they are the same thing. When I came to England, I told myself I came for the Accords. That was a lie I told even to myself. I came because our great-aunt's prophecy had haunted me my whole life. One son, the undoing of the house. And I came to England to look at the house and at the sun they kept, and to understand at last which of us had carried the curse. I came, brother, half hoping to find you a ruin, so that I might feel finally that exile had been a gift and not a wound. And instead, I found you, cold and proud, and so locked inside yourself that I could hardly find the boy I might have been. And then I watched a woman walk into a room, and I watched your whole locked self turn toward her like a plant toward a window, and I understood the prophecy at last. It was never about ruin. The old woman was half mad, and we all read her wrong for 30 years. One son would be the undoing of the house, and undoing is not the same as destroying. You undid it, Draco. You undid the cold thing they built. You unmade the fortress, brick by brick, and the only one who could ever have done it was the son who carried the whole weight of the house long enough to learn how heavy it was. I could never have undone it. I was never inside it. The exile they meant as my punishment was only ever the reason I stayed whole, and the reason I could never have been the one to save you. Only you could do that. You and the woman who refused to stop arguing with you long enough to leave. So here is my gift. I forgive you for the night you wore my face. I forgave you the morning I learned of it, and I have been waiting 2 years for the right moment to say so, and a wedding is as right as moments come. You did not steal her from me. You let her stop hiding from herself, and you did it the only graceless, desperate way you knew, because no one ever taught you a gentle one. I have made my peace with being the brother who was sent away. I would not trade my mountains, or my Yana, or my whole warm, undeserved life for any of it. We were 2 infants in a single cradle, and the world tried to make us enemies, and we have foiled it. That is the only revenge worth taking on a prophecy. Come and dance at my wedding. Bring your impossible wife. Yana has heard so much of you both that she has begun to suspect I invented you. The blue flowers are out above the snow line, Hermione. I promised you once I would show you where they grow, and I keep my promises, even the ones I made before I knew how the story ended. Come home, brother. It took us 30 years to have one. Let us not waste it. Corvus Draco lowered the letter. For a moment he did not speak, and Hermione saw the brightness in his eyes that he no longer bothered to hide from her, and she took the parchment gently from his hands and folded it along its soft, worn creases and tucked it back into his breast pocket, over his heart, where it belonged. "He's wrong about one thing," Draco said at last, roughly. "Only one. He says I undid the fortress." He looked at her, and there was no fortress left in the look at all, nothing held back, nothing guarded. "I didn't. I'd have died inside it. You took it apart with your bare hands, every wall, and you weren't even kind about it." A ghost of the old dryness, warmed now all the way through. "You argued me out into the open air. I'd never have come out for gentleness. I only ever came out for a fight." "I know," she said. "It's the most useful thing about you." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind the boy by the fire had never once been allowed, and pulled her in, and the disastrous half-packed trunk tipped its careful piles of robes onto the floor unheeded, and outside the window of the narrow, tall house, the summer morning went on bright and ordinary over the rooftops of London. They left that afternoon by International Portkey, an old battered samovar that deposited them, breathless and laughing and clutching their luggage, on a green Bulgarian hillside where the air was thin and cold and smelled of pine and high places and something far away. And Corvus was there, running down the slope toward them with his arms already open, warm as he had ever been, with a dark-eyed witch beside him whose laugh carried clear across the valley. And the two brothers, the kept and the castaway, the cold and the warm, met halfway up the hill and stood holding one another for a long time without a single word. Two men with one face who had finally, against everything the world had built to keep them apart, become the same family. And high above them, just where Corvus had always promised, above the snow line where nothing was supposed to be able to grow, the blue flowers were out in their thousands, blooming impossibly in the cold, thin air. Proof, if anyone had needed it, that the hardest and most exiled places can bring forth the most astonishing things, and that no prophecy ever written has the final say over a heart that decides, at last, to want what is true. Hermione slipped her hand into her husband's. The silver ring was cold against her skin, and his fingers closed around hers, warm and sure, and somewhere a Bulgarian fiddle had begun to play, and the whole green hillside was full of light. They went down together to the wedding. The wedding was held in the open air on a terrace of pale stone cut into the mountainside, beneath a sky so close and so blue it seemed a thing one could reach up and press a palm against. There were no gilded chandeliers here, no floating lights, no ministry gold. There were only lanterns strung between the pines, and long tables dressed in undyed linen, and 100 Bulgarian witches and wizards who laughed too loudly and danced too early and embraced Draco Malfoy when Corvus presented him, as though the cold English name had never carried a single shadow. Hermione watched her husband endure it. That was the only word for it at first. Endure. He stood very straight among Corvus's loud, warm relations, his hands clasped behind his back, his face arranged in the careful neutrality she had spent 2 years learning to read. And she could see the old armor trying to buckle itself back on, the instinct to go cold and untouchable when surrounded by warmth he did not know how to receive. An ancient witch with a face like a walnut seized both his cheeks in her hands and said something rapid and fond in Bulgarian, and Hermione watched his jaw tighten, watched the knuckle-white grip of his clasped hands behind his back, and started across the terrace to rescue him. She did not reach him in time. Corvus got there first. He appeared at his brother's shoulder, said something low, and the walnut-faced witch laughed and released Draco's cheeks and patted them instead. And then Corvus did a small, extraordinary thing. He stood beside his brother, shoulder to shoulder, facing the crowd with him, so that Draco was no longer alone in front of all that warmth, but braced against it by someone who shared his exact face and none of his fear. And Hermione, stopping where she was, saw her husband's clasped hands slowly unknot behind his back, saw the shoulders come down, saw him turn his head a fraction toward his brother, the kept son and the castaway one, identical in profile against the lantern light, and say something that made Corvus throw back his head and laugh, the loud, unguarded laugh of the mountains, and after a moment, haltingly, as though using a muscle he'd forgotten he owned, Draco laughed too. She did not go to him after all. Some moments belonged to the two of them, 30 years late, and she had no wish to be inside them. She took a glass of pale green wine from a passing tray and stood at the terrace's edge and let them have it. He is different here. Yana had come to stand beside her, the bride, dark-eyed and luminous, her wedding robes the deep blue of the flowers above the snow line. She watched the two brothers with open affection. "You're Draco. Corvus told me he was made of ice and barbed wire. I expected to dislike him. Instead, I find a man trying very hard, in a language he does not speak, to be loved by people he has only just met." She turned her clever dark gaze on Hermione. "That is not ice. That is a man who was taught the wrong lesson and is unlearning it in public, which is the bravest unlearning there is." "He'd hate that you noticed," Hermione said. "Then I shall never tell him." Yana smiled. "But I tell you, because you are the one who must keep him brave, and it is good to know the work is not yours alone. He has a brother now. The brother will help." The dancing began in earnest as the light went long and golden over the valley. There were dances Hermione did not know, fast and stamping and joyous, and the walnut-faced witch dragged her into one, and she stumbled through it laughing. And when she was released, breathless, to the edge of the terrace, she found Draco waiting for her there with 2 glasses and an expression she had never quite seen on him before, loosened, unbarred, almost shy. "I can't do that," he said, nodding at the stamping dancers. "Whatever that is, there's no version of me that survives attempting it." "I know, but..." He set down both glasses on the parapet. The sun was sinking behind the far ridge, and the blue flowers above the snow line had caught the last of it and seemed to glow. He held out his hand, palm up, open, the silver signet dark against his skin. And there was no fortress anywhere in the gesture, no calculation, only a man asking for something he had finally learned he was allowed to ask for. "There's a slow one coming. The fiddler's been threatening it. I can manage slow. I've had practice. There was a wall once, at a ministry function, where I stood and watched a woman refuse to dance, and I have regretted for 2 years that I wasn't the one who asked her." Hermione looked at the offered hand. She thought of gold light and floating lanterns shaped like jellyfish, of a stranger crossing a crowded room with the wrong smile on the right face, of how the whole strange story had begun with one brother's open palm and was ending, now, with the others. "You weren't ready to ask me then," she said. "No, I'd have ruined it." He didn't drop his hand. "I'm still going to ruin it. I'll step on you at least twice. I want to do it anyway." She put her hand in his. The fiddle found its slow tune, and the lanterns swayed in the thin, cold air, and he drew her in against him with a care that still, after 2 years, surprised her. This man, who did nothing else in his life, gently, gentle only here, only with her. His hand settled at the small of her back. Her cheek found the place against his collar that had become, over 2 years, simply hers. And they turned, slowly, badly, beautifully, at the edge of a Bulgarian terrace, with the whole valley dropping away gold beneath them, and Corvus and Yana turned nearby, and the walnut-faced witch wept happily into a handkerchief, and high above them all the impossible flowers burned blue in the last of the light. "He was right, you know," Draco murmured against her hair. "My brother, in the letter, about the prophecy, that you undid the house. That undoing isn't destroying. His arms tightened. I spent my whole life waiting to be the ruin they were so sure one of us would be. I made myself into it. The mark, the manner, all of it. I thought they were right. I'm the curse. I'm the one who'll bring it down. He drew back just far enough to look at her, and his grey eyes in the gold light held nothing back at all. And I did bring it down. The cold thing, the fortress. I brought the whole of it down, and I stood in the rubble waiting to be damned for it. And instead, his voice roughened. Instead, there was you, in my study, in the rain, telling me you wanted the difficult one. The curse wasn't that one of us would ruin the house, Hermione. The curse was that we'd believe the word ruin could only ever mean one thing. She reached up and laid her palm against his cheek, over the place the walnut-faced witch had patted, over the careful jaw that had learned, slowly, to unclench. "Stop talking now," she said softly. "You'll only ruin it." "I told you I would." "Then ruin it properly." And he did. He bent his head and kissed her, slow and sure and entirely his own, in the failing gold light with the fiddle playing, and his brother dancing a dozen feet away, and the blue flowers blazing on the heights above the snow line. The two of them turning in place, no distance left between them, a man and the woman who had argued him out into the open air. At the end of the long story the world had built to keep them apart, and had, against every prophecy ever spoken, magnificently failed to finish the way it intended. Below them, the valley filled with dusk. The lanterns came into their own, and somewhere in the warm Bulgarian dark, two brothers with one face and two entirely different hearts had finally, against all of it, come home.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. I want to tell you why I wrote this story. I have always loved the idea of two brothers with one face. One is warm, one is cold. The world looked at them and decided which one was good, but the world was wrong. That was the heart of this story for me. We all do this. We look at the person and we say, I know what you are. But people are not that simple. The cold man was not cold. He was only afraid. He learned to hide. He learned to look away from the fire. There is one part I think about a lot. Hermione tells him she does not want the man who makes her happy and easy. She wants the difficult one. She wants the one who makes the whole room go tight. I love this moment because real love is not always soft. Sometimes love is a fight. Sometimes love is a person who sees you when you are at your worst and does not run. I also wanted a kind ending, not a sad one. The hidden brother did not lose. He found his own home, his own bride, his own mountains. Nobody had to be the villain. So that is a small wish for you today. Look again at the cold people in your life. Maybe they are not cold. Maybe they are just afraid. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart. I will see you in the next story.